Attention, all faculty of the Galactic Xenobiology Institute. I, Senior Researcher Quirzap of the esteemed Floridian species, am about to embark on what will undoubtedly be the most historically significant and potentially fatal research expedition ever recorded in our 12,000 years of scientific endeavors. My tentacles quivered as I recorded this opening statement to my research log. Dramatic, perhaps, but when you're about to make first contact with the most terrifying species in the known universe, a little drama seems warranted. Computer, append personal note, I said, lowering my voice. I'm absolutely terrified and questioning every life decision that led me to this point. The ship's AI chirped in acknowledgement as I stared out the viewport at the approaching neutral moon where we'd established the meeting point. Somewhere down there, actual living humans were waiting. My 4 hearts pounded arrhythmically. Quirzap, stop narrating to yourself and help me calibrate these atmospheric filters. My assistant Zlor called from the lab compartment, his voice hitting that particular pitch of anxious irritation I'd become all too familiar with during our 3-cycle journey. I'm not narrating, I'm documenting, I corrected him, floating toward the lab. This mission will revolutionize our understanding of evolutionary biology. Do you realize no Floridian has ever survived direct contact with humans before? Yes, that's precisely why I've been stress molting for the past week, Zlork muttered, his normally green skin now an unhealthy shade of yellow. Did you read the latest briefing from Admiral Paz-Tal? They drink corrosive chemicals for pleasure. I waved my upper tentacles dismissively. That's why we're meeting on neutral ground with extensive safety protocols. Besides, primitive species are often most interesting just before they achieve interstellar capabilities. We're making history here. We're making obituaries, more likely, Zlork grumbled, but continued adjusting the filters that would hopefully protect us from the humans' deadly exhalations. It's difficult to explain to non-Floridians why Earth is classified as the most extreme death world ever catalogued. It's not just the obvious hazards, crushing gravity, toxic oxygen levels, and temperature fluctuations that would boil our cellular structure. No, it's the fact that every single aspect of that nightmare planet seems designed to kill. And somehow, against all logical expectations, it produced humans. Final system check complete, the ship's computer announced. Atmospheric composition within survival parameters. Radiation shielding operational. Emergency teleportation beacons charged. I pulled myself up to my full height, an impressive 2 meters in this gravity, and adjusted my protective suit. Begin transmission to Galactic Institute archives, I said with as much dignity as I could muster. The following documentation will serve as both scientific record and, should the worst occur, my final testimony. Really laying it on thick, aren't you? Zlork muttered. These are historic words, Zlork. Show some respect for future generations who will study them. Future generations will call you the idiot who got himself killed by hairless apes because he wanted tenure. I ignored him. Today we make first official contact with humanity. A species so uniquely adapted to extreme environments that they consider liquid water falling from the sky to be pleasant. A species whose young engage in recreational activities that would kill adult Floridians instantly. A species that voluntarily exposes their skin to solar radiation for cosmetic purposes. The landing alert sounded, and my chromatophores involuntarily flashed a pattern of pure terror. But fear not, colleagues, I continued, trying to steady my voice. I, Quirzap, will document everything for science. For science, Zlork echoed weakly as our ship began its final descent. Our landing craft settled onto the lunar surface with a gentle thud that nevertheless sent Zlork sprawling across the deck, his limbs flailing dramatically. Minimal gravitational adjustment required, announced our ship's computer with what I swear was a hint of mockery. Easy for you to say, Zlork complained, struggling to his feet. You don't have fluid-filled equilibrium sacks. I adjusted my protective suit one final time, checking the seals with perhaps excessive thoroughness. Remember, no direct contact with human skin. Their natural oils contain acids that could dissolve our epidermis on contact. What about their breath? Zlork asked, voice trembling. I read they exhale carbon dioxide. Actual carbon dioxide, like from volcanoes. That's why we have the air filters, obviously, I said, trying to project confidence I absolutely did not feel. Now look, professional. We represent the entire Galactic Xenobiology Institute. The airlock hissed open, revealing the barren, rocky landscape of neutral moon KDG-42. And standing there, about 30 meters away, were three figures that made my chromatophores flash involuntarily in panic patterns. Humans. They stood impossibly tall and straight, balanced effortlessly on just two limbs despite the gravity. Their exposed faces, actual exposed skin in an extraterrestrial environment, displayed rows of white, bony protrusions. Later I would learn these were called smiles and weren't meant as threatening displays, but at that moment, I was certain we were about to be devoured. Greetings, representatives of Earth, I called through our translator, my voice only cracking slightly. I am Senior Researcher Quirzap, and this is my assistant Zlork. We come seeking scientific exchange and peaceful dialogue. The tallest human stepped forward. My scanner registered dangerously high body temperature. They were practically walking furnaces. Captain Nalia Vex of the Earth Diplomatic Corps, she said, her voice surprisingly melodious for a Deathworld predator. This is Dr. Thomas Blackwood, our xenobiologist, and Security Officer Finn Reeves. Welcome to KDG-42. Blackwood, a slighter male specimen with facial fur, raised one of those alarming appendages they call hands in what I later learned was a greeting gesture rather than a prelude to attack. We brought samples of our atmosphere for your analysis, Blackwood said, holding up a container of swirling gases that would literally melt our respiratory systems on contact. He offered it like it was a gift basket. That's thoughtful, I managed, signaling to Zlork to accept it with our hazardous materials robot. Perhaps keep it sealed for now. Captain Vex's face contorted into what my cultural database identified as an expression of amusement. Dr. Blackwood is a little eager. We've prepared a sealed meeting habitat with customizable environmental controls for our discussions. I was about to respond when our atmospheric sensors began blaring an alarm. Zlork immediately fell to the ground in the traditional Floridian panic position, all limbs tucked protectively around his central mass. What's happening? I gasped, my voice shooting up several octaves. Dr. Blackwood glanced at a device strapped to his wrist, directly touching his skin, and frowned. Interesting. The moon's entering the gas giant's magnetosphere. We're about to experience a sulfuric acid precipitation event. A what? Zlork shrieked from his panic ball. As if on cue, the sky darkened ominously. The first drops began to fall, actual corrosive acid falling from the sky. My protective suit sizzled where the drops landed, the outer layer beginning to degrade. We need emergency extraction. I shouted into my communicator, but our ship responded with static. The magnetosphere was blocking signals. Acid rain, Captain Vex said with what appeared to be casual interest, like she was commenting on a scenic view rather than our imminent dissolution. Pretty mild compared to Venus Colony, but it'll eat through your suits in about 10 minutes. Mild, I screeched, my vocal sac inflating in distress. This is mild? The humans exchanged glances. Then, with horrifying casualness, Captain Vex reached into a pack on her back and pulled out what looked like thin sheets of material. Weather's turning faster than predicted, she said calmly. Finn, deploy the emergency shelter. Dr. Blackwood, help our new friends. Their mobility seems compromised. While I was still processing the phrase weather's turning, as if deadly acid precipitation was comparable to a light breeze, the humans sprang into action with alarming efficiency. Blackwood approached us, holding out the sheets, which I now saw were some kind of protective covering. These are acid-resistant tarps. May I? Without waiting for a response, which was fortunate because I was physically incapable of speech at that moment, he draped the material over my quivering form and then moved to help the entirely unresponsive Zlork. Meanwhile, Officer Reeves had somehow erected a dome-like structure in seconds, using what looked like primitively simple tools. Captain Vex was calmly typing on a portable device, seemingly unbothered by the intensifying chemical downpour that was literally melting the rocks around us. "Shelter's ready." "Let's move," she called out. "I recommend a hopping motion for our Floridian friends. The acid's beginning to pool." Blackwood gently but firmly guided me toward the shelter, while Reeves simply picked up the still catatonic Zlork like he weighed nothing. "Don't worry," Blackwood said with what I think was meant to be reassurance. "This kind of thing happens all the time on Earth exploration missions. You get used to it." As the acid rain intensified and we hurried toward the shelter, I had a sudden, horrifying realization. If this was what humans considered mild weather, what in the name of the galactic core was their homeworld actually like? Inside the emergency shelter, my respiratory flaps finally resumed normal function as our environmental suit's auto-repair systems began addressing the acid damage. The humans had constructed this haven with alarming speed, using materials so thin I could practically see the deadly precipitation through them. Yet somehow, they held. "Atmosphere stabilizing," announced a small device Captain Vex had placed in the center of the shelter. Oxygen levels reduced to 12%, temperature holding at 28 degrees Celsius. Zlork was still trembling in the corner, his chromatophores cycling through emergency patterns. I tried to maintain some semblance of scientific dignity. "Your quick response was most appreciated," I managed to say to Captain Vex. "Our data suggested acid precipitation events were rare on this moon." "They are," Dr. Blackwood replied, unzipping his protective suit to reveal another, thinner layer of fabric beneath. My scanner immediately registered the heat radiating from his body. "But we always prepare for environmental anomalies. Standard Earth core protocol." Officer Reeves was arranging various containers near the shelter's entrance. "Storms intensifying. Neural readings suggest we'll be here for about 6 hours. "Neural readings?" I couldn't help asking. Reeves tapped his temple. "Cranial implant next to our weather satellites." He said this as casually as I might mention having an extra limb. "You put technology inside your bodies?" "Voluntarily." Zlork had finally recovered enough to speak, though his voice remained higher pitched than normal. The humans exchanged amused glances. "Would you like something to drink?" Captain Vex asked, clearly changing the subject. "We've brought refreshments suitable for most carbon-based life forms." Before I could warn Zlork against consuming anything prepared by predators, Captain Vex had opened one of their containers and removed a steaming vessel. The aroma that filled the shelter made my sensory tendrils curl protectively. "This is what we call coffee," she explained, pouring the black liquid into small containers. "It's a stimulant beverage quite popular on Earth." Dr. Blackwood accepted a container and immediately consumed the liquid. My scientific instruments went wild. That substance contains alkaloids that would be classified as neurotoxins on at least 67 known worlds. "Does it?" Blackwood seemed genuinely surprised. He took another deliberate sip while maintaining eye contact with me. "It's actually considered quite mild on Earth. Some humans drink 10 or 12 of these daily." Zlork made a strangled noise. "Perhaps your species would prefer water?" Officer Reeves suggested, offering a different container. "Dihydrogen monoxide in its pure form." "No thank you. We've brought our own nutrient solutions," I said quickly, gesturing to our sealed food systems. Captain Vex shrugged and reached into another container, extracting what appeared to be wrapped food items. When she opened one, my chemical sensors detected compounds that would be used as industrial solvents on our world. What is that? I couldn't help asking as she bit into it without hesitation. Protein bar with chili peppers, she answered through a mouthful. Want one? They're great for keeping warm during extended missions. Chili peppers? I repeated slowly. Capsaicin containing plant matter, Dr. Blackwood explained, his tone taking on that of a fellow scientist. Creates a burning sensation when consumed. You eat things that burn you? Intentionally? Zlork had begun to edge toward our emergency escape pods, though they'd be useless in the current storm. Captain Vex laughed. It's not actually burning, just stimulates the same neural receptors. It's quite pleasant, actually. Makes you feel alive. We already feel alive without pain stimulation. Thank you, I said faintly. As the acid storm raged outside, buffeting our shelter with sounds like angry predators, the humans continued their casual consumption of substances that would hospitalize a Floridian. I tried to maintain my scientific objectivity, recording observations while Zlork muttered emergency prayers to celestial deities most educated Floridians had stopped believing in centuries ago. So Captain Vex said conversationally, wiping crumbs of the pain food from her mouth, your preliminary communications mentioned you consider Earth a Deathworld. That's actually quite flattering. Flattering? I blinked my 4 eyes in sequence, a sign of confusion. It's a scientific classification based on habitability metrics. On Earth, we have a saying, Officer Reeves interjected. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. The humans all nodded, as if this made perfect sense. What exactly does kill you then? I asked, scientific curiosity temporarily overcoming my survival instincts. Captain Vex smiled, showing those alarming white bone structures again. Not much these days, but historically? Let me tell you about Australian wildlife. For the next hour, as the storm howled outside, Captain Vex regaled us with tales of creatures called box jellyfish that could kill humans within minutes through skin contact alone, of inland taipans, whose toxic bite could end human life faster than emergency medical intervention could prevent, of microscopic organisms that invaded human bodies to consume them from within. And these creatures still exist on your planet? I asked, fascinated despite my horror. Oh yes, Dr. Blackwood nodded enthusiastically. Many of them are protected species now. We maintain wildlife preserves for them. You preserve things that can kill you? Zlork had given up on prayer and moved on to quiet whimpering. Of course, Captain Vex said, as if this were the most natural thing in the galaxy. They're part of our ecosystem, our history. I sat back, my recording instruments whirring constantly. Something wasn't adding up. According to our understanding, humans should be constantly terrified, living on a planet filled with such dangers. And yet they spoke of deadly predators with something approaching affection? I think, I said slowly, our species' understanding of dangerous may need significant revision. The humans exchanged knowing smiles, and Captain Vex offered me something she called a cookie. I politely declined. The acid concentration is dropping, Officer Reeves announced, checking his wrist device. The storm should clear in approximately 47 minutes. I was in the midst of recording my 43rd observation about human digestive capabilities when a low, resonant vibration shook the shelter. At first, I assumed it was merely a weather fluctuation. Atmospheric disturbance? I inquired, trying to sound like a calm, rational scientist rather than a terrified blob of nerves. But the humans had stopped talking. Their postures changed instantly, transforming from relaxed to alert in a way that made my survival instincts scream in warning. That's not the storm, Captain Vex said quietly, her hand moving to a device strapped to her thigh. Blackwood, what are we looking at? Dr. Blackwood was studying a handheld scanner, his previously jovial expression gone. Large biosignature. Very large. Moving toward us at approximately 20 meters per minute. I thought this moon was uninhabited, I said, my voice rising involuntarily. It was supposed to be, Captain Vex replied, her tone eerily calm. Preliminary surveys showed no complex life forms. But preliminary surveys are often wrong, Officer Reeves stated matter-of-factly, pulling equipment from his pack with practiced efficiency. That's why we're here to verify. Another vibration, stronger this time. Zlork had gone completely rigid, his survival response kicking in. Floridians freeze when threatened. An evolutionary adaptation that works wonderfully against visual predators, but does absolutely nothing against whatever was making the ground shake. What is it? I managed to ask as the humans continued their practiced movements, assembling what were clearly defensive implements. Unknown, Dr. Blackwood answered, studying his scanner. But it's big, 7 meters at least. And its body chemistry, he paused, looking genuinely concerned for the first time. It's producing compounds similar to the acid rain, highly caustic. An acid-based predator? Captain Vex sounded almost impressed. That's a new one. Not entirely new, Blackwood corrected. Remember the silicon-based life forms on Tau Ceti Prime? Similar adaptation. They were discussing comparative xenobiology while something large enough to crush our shelter was approaching. My scientific mind briefly noted this as another example of bizarre human behavior before my survival instincts took over completely. We need to evacuate, I cried, my chromatophores flashing emergency patterns. All your ship will be dissolved. Can't, Officer Reeves said calmly, assembling what looked like a primitive projectile weapon. Magnetosphere interference, remember? Besides, the acid rain would dissolve our transport before we got to orbit. So we're going to die here. Zlork had finally recovered enough to speak, though he remained completely immobile. Die. Hardly, Captain Vex said with a sound I later learned was called a snort. We're just going to introduce ourselves properly to the local wildlife. The ground beneath us shuddered violently. Outside, through the translucent material of the shelter, a massive shadow loomed. The creature must have been drawn by our heat signatures, or perhaps the organic compounds in our supplies. Whatever the reason, it was now directly outside our only barrier. Fascinating adaptive camouflage, Dr. Blackwood muttered, still somehow focusing on scientific observation. Its external membrane mimics the rocky substrate almost perfectly. Save the research notes for later, Doc, Captain Vex said, though not unkindly. Reeves' non-lethal options? Not with these acid levels, Officer Reeves replied, finishing his assembly of what I now recognized as some kind of energy weapon. Conventional stun measures would trigger a chemical reaction, might cause an explosion. Lethal it is. Then, Captain Vex sighed, sounding genuinely disappointed. Try to preserve as much of the specimen as possible for Blackwood's research. My brain struggled to process what was happening. The humans were discussing how to attack the massive acid-producing predator rather than accepting their inevitable demise. Even more incomprehensibly, they seemed concerned about preserving parts of it for study. A massive appendage, something between a tentacle and a drilling apparatus, punched through the roof of our shelter. Acid dripped from it, instantly beginning to dissolve the flooring. Zlork and I both emitted high-pitched distress calls, the Floridian equivalent of screaming. What happened next occurred so quickly that my recording devices barely captured it. Captain Vex rolled beneath the thrashing appendage, avoiding both its crushing weight and the acid drops. Officer Reeves fired his weapon with precision that seemed impossible for organic life forms, severing the appendage at what appeared to be a joint. The creature outside emitted a sound that vibrated at a frequency painful to my auditory receptors. The severed appendage thrashed wildly, spraying acid across the shelter. Dr. Blackwood, who had been standing protectively in front of us, deployed some kind of shield that neutralized the acid on contact. It's going to try to dig under us, Captain Vex shouted, somehow intuiting the creature's next move. Reeves, perimeter defenses. Already on it, Officer Reeves replied, tossing small devices around the shelter's boundary. They burrowed into the ground automatically. The creature's next attack came from below, just as Captain Vex had predicted. The floor bulged upward, beginning to split apart. But when the creature breached the surface, Officer Reeves' devices activated, creating an energy field that caused the predator to recoil with another ear-splitting shriek. "We've got about 2 minutes before it tries a different approach," Officer Reeves said, checking his scanner. "It's learning our defenses quickly." "Then we don't give it time to learn," Captain Vex decided. She turned to us, her expression serious but not fearful. "Stay here. Whatever happens, don't leave the shelter unless Blackwood tells you to." Before I could protest, Captain Vex and Officer Reeves had exited the shelter, moving with coordination that suggested they'd faced similar situations countless times before. "Aren't they going to be dissolved by the acid rain?" I asked Dr. Blackwood, who was calmly preparing what looked like medical supplies. "Their suits can handle it for about 10 minutes, he replied. "Should be enough time." "Enough time for what?" Zlork asked, finding his voice again. Dr. Blackwood smiled grimly. "To convince our new friend to look for dinner elsewhere." Through the shelter walls, we witnessed something I still struggle to describe accurately in scientific terms. The two humans, tiny against the now visible bulk of the creature, moved like they were performing a choreographed dance. They used the environment, the creature's own momentum, and their seemingly primitive weapons with an efficiency that defied logical explanation. "Are all humans combat specialists?" I asked, unable to look away from the spectacle. "Hardly," Dr. Blackwood laughed. "Vex was a park ranger before joining the Corps. Reeves teaches xenobiology to children. This is just basic training for anyone who works in field exploration." "Basic," Zlork and I said simultaneously, our vocal flaps vibrating in astonishment. Outside, the enormous predator finally retreated, leaving a trail of caustic fluid as it disappeared into the storm-darkened landscape. Captain Vex and Officer Reeves returned to the shelter, their protective suits showing significant damage but their bodies somehow intact. "Well," Captain Vex said cheerfully as she removed her helmet, "that was invigorating. Haven't had a workout like that since the methane swamps on Titan." I stared at them, these impossibly resilient beings who had just driven off a predator that would have ended my entire research team without a second thought. "You're not even injured," I observed, my scientific curiosity momentarily overriding my terror. "Oh, I'll have bruises tomorrow," Captain Vex said, rotating her shoulder with a slight wince. "But nothing serious. Reeves got a small acid splash on his arm, though." Officer Reeves was already applying some kind of treatment to a wound that would have been life-threatening to a Floridian. Just a surface burn. Didn't even reach the dermis. I struggled to find the words. "You fought an unknown acid-producing mega-predator with handheld weapons, and you're discussing it like it was a minor inconvenience." The three humans looked at each other, genuine confusion on their faces. "What else would we do?" Captain Vex asked, as if there were no other logical response to the situation. And in that moment, I began to understand why humans were truly the most terrifying species in the galaxy. "The shelter integrity is compromised," Officer Reeves announced, examining the acid-eaten holes in our once secure haven. "Structural failure imminent in approximately 22 minutes. "And the storm's getting worse, not better," Captain Vex added, studying data on her wrist device. "Satellite readings show we're moving into the primary band now. Acid concentration will double within the hour." I felt my central nervous system begin to shut down at this news. Zlork had already entered a semi-catatonic state, his body's natural response to overwhelming threats. "Surely your ship can extract us now that the predator is gone?" I asked, trying to keep the pleading tone from my voice. Scientific dignity demanded at least that much. Dr. Blackwood shook his head. "Magnetosphere's too unstable. No communications, no transport lock. And we need to reach the backup shelter at Survey Point Echo. How far is that? I asked, dreading the answer. 3 kilometers, Captain Vex replied casually, as if suggesting a pleasant stroll rather than a death march through acid rain and predator-infested terrain. 3. But we can't, I stammered. Can your species handle 0.8 standard gravity movement for that distance? Officer Reeves asked, already packing essential supplies. But before I could answer that no, absolutely not, our physiological limitations made such a journey completely impossible. Captain Vex was examining Zlork with a critical eye. He's in shock, she stated. Some kind of protective hibernation? Stress-induced metabolic suspension, I corrected automatically. It's how our species responds to extreme danger. He'll be unresponsive for at least 6 hours. We don't have 6 hours, Dr. Blackwood said, looking at the rapidly deteriorating shelter ceiling. We barely have 20 minutes. Captain Vex nodded decisively. Reeves, you take the assistant. Blackwood, help our conscious friend here. I'll take point and watch for our acid-loving friend or any of its relatives. Before I could protest, Officer Reeves had gently lifted Zlork's rigid form as if he weighed nothing. Dr. Blackwood approached me with what I think was meant to be a reassuring expression. We'll need to move quickly. Your environmental suit should protect you from brief acid exposure, but try not to linger in open areas. Stay directly behind me at all times. This is suicide, I said flatly, my scientific objectivity finally overwhelmed by the situation. We should remain here and hope for rescue. The shelter will collapse in 19 minutes and 18 seconds, Officer Reeves stated. And the predator will return, possibly with others. They've identified us as potential food. We move now or we die here, Captain Vex said with finality. Those are the options. When framed that way, my decision matrix simplified considerably. 17 minutes later, we were moving across the lunar surface in tight formation, the acid rain sizzling against our protective gear as the storm intensified around us. Captain Vex took the lead, her movements economical and precise. Officer Reeves followed, somehow carrying Zlork's rigid body while simultaneously scanning our surroundings for threats. Dr. Blackwood stayed close to me, occasionally steadying me when my limbs failed to coordinate properly in the harsh conditions. Keep moving, he encouraged when I faltered after the first kilometer. Your suit integrity is at 64% and dropping. How is your species doing this? I gasped, my respiratory flaps struggling to process enough oxygen. You're carrying dead weight through acid rain in low gravity, and you're not even breathing heavily. Dr. Blackwood smiled. Humans evolved on a high-gravity world with extreme environmental variations. Our ancestors survived ice ages, droughts, floods, and competing predators. Those who couldn't adapt didn't pass on their genes. We paused briefly beneath a rocky overhang. My scientific curiosity momentarily overcame my physical distress. But adaptation occurs over millions of cycles, I argued. No species could evolve fast enough to handle such diverse threats. That's where you're wrong, Dr. Blackwood replied, checking my suit for damage. We didn't adapt to specific threats. We evolved adaptability itself. Flexibility became our specialized trait. Captain Vex signaled from ahead. Movement to the north. Large mass, similar signature to our friend from earlier. Keep moving, Officer Reeves said calmly, adjusting Zlork's position on his shoulder. As we continued our desperate journey, Dr. Blackwood continued his impromptu lecture. Earth has over 8 major biomes, each with different survival challenges. Humans originated in one but spread to all of them, from Arctic tundra to Saharan desert, from Himalayan peaks to Amazon rainforest. Without evolutionary adaptations? I asked, genuinely fascinated despite our perilous situation. Without waiting for them, he corrected. We created tools, clothing, shelter. We changed our environment rather than waiting for our bodies to change. And when that wasn't enough, we changed ourselves culturally, socially, eventually technologically. A particularly strong gust of acid-laden wind hit us, and my suit integrity alarm began to sound. Dr. Blackwood immediately removed a patch from his pack and applied it to my suit, stopping the degradation. "You're using your own supplies for me," I observed, shocked. "Of course," he replied, as if this were obvious. "Team survival supersedes individual risk assessment." I recorded this statement for later analysis, certain it contained some profound insight into human psychology. We had covered nearly 2 kilometers when disaster struck. The ground beneath us trembled, and a massive form erupted from the surface ahead, another acid predator, perhaps attracted by our movement. "Defensive formation," Captain Vex called out, her voice steady despite the imminent threat. What happened next defied my understanding of biology. Officer Reeves gently but quickly placed Zlork in a protected crevice, then moved to stand beside Captain Vex. Dr. Blackwood urged me into the same crevice, placing his body between the predator and us. "Wait here," he said simply. "We'll handle this." As I watched these 3 humans face a creature 3 times their combined mass, I activated my recording instruments, determined to document whatever happened next. If we somehow survived, the Galactic Xenobiology Institute would need to completely revise their understanding of the species called human. "Remarkable adaptation strategy," I murmured into my recorder as the humans coordinated their defense. "They don't run from superior predators. They become the superior predators." The humans dispatched the second predator with even greater efficiency than the first. I later learned this was because they had figured out its weaknesses, as if deadly apex predators were puzzles to be solved rather than forces of nature to be fled from. Our reprieve was short-lived. As we crested a ridge, we found ourselves facing a vast chasm that hadn't appeared on any of the survey maps. The acid rain had eroded the landscape, creating a gulf at least 30 meters wide and of indeterminate depth. "Well, that's inconvenient," Captain Vex remarked, peering over the edge with what appeared to be mild annoyance rather than appropriate terror. "Survey Point Echo is directly on the other side," Officer Reeves confirmed, checking his navigation device. "No viable detour within our suit integrity timeframe." My communication device suddenly crackled to life. The magnetosphere must have shifted temporarily, allowing signals to penetrate. Senior Researcher Quirzap, came Admiral Postal's voice, distorted but recognizable. "Report status immediately." "Admiral," I exclaimed, relief washing over me. "We require immediate extraction. Environmental catastrophe, indigenous predators, imminent suit failure." "Negative on extraction," the Admiral cut me off. "Magnetosphere fluctuations make approach impossible. All ships are moving to safe orbital distance." My relief evaporated instantly. "But Admiral, we will not survive without extraction." There was a pause. "Then, the Galactic Institute appreciates your sacrifice in the name of science, Researcher Quirzap. Your data will be analyzed thoroughly, and your names will be added to the Memorial of Distinguished Researchers." The communication cut off abruptly as the magnetosphere shifted again. I stared at my device in disbelief. They're abandoning us," I said, my voice hollow. "They're not coming." "Wait." Zlork, who had partially recovered from his catatonic state, immediately relapsed, his body going rigid once more. "Well," Dr. Blackwood said after a moment, "that's unfortunate, but not entirely unexpected given the conditions." I stared at him incredulously. "Not unexpected?" "They've left us to die." "They've left you to solve your own problem," Captain Vex corrected, already examining the chasm edges. "There's a difference." "There is no solution," I insisted, my scientific rationality taking cold inventory of our situation. "The chasm is too wide to cross. Our suits will fail within 40 minutes. The acid concentration is increasing. More predators are likely approaching. These are insurmountable obstacles. The three humans exchanged glances I couldn't interpret. Insurmountable? Officer Reeves repeated, as if the word was unfamiliar. I don't think we accept that classification. Reeves, what's our cable strength with the remaining equipment? Captain Vex asked, already removing items from her pack. Approximately 400 kilograms tensile strength, he replied, following her lead. Blackwood, those rock formations look relatively acid-resistant. Stability assessment? Dr. Blackwood was already scanning the jutting rocks on our side of the chasm. Crystallized silicon compounds should hold under tension if we distribute the load correctly. I watched in bewilderment as they began unpacking equipment, calculating angles, and discussing tension ratios. They were actually attempting to cross the uncrossable chasm. This is irrational, I stated flatly. The probability of success is negligible. Probably, Captain Vex agreed cheerfully, hammering a spike into the rock with practiced efficiency. But the probability of surviving if we don't try is zero. So mathematically speaking, any non-zero chance is infinitely better. I blinked all four of my eyes in sequence, trying to process this logic. But failure is almost certain. Almost, Dr. Blackwood emphasized, testing a cable attachment. That's the key word there. Almost means there's room for human ingenuity. As they continued their improbable construction project, I found myself recording observations on a level I hadn't considered before. It wasn't just their physical resilience that made humans dangerous. It wasn't even their adaptability to hostile environments. It was their absolute refusal to accept defeat. You don't understand probability, I said finally. Captain Vex looked up from her work, that alarming display of teeth, a smile spreading across her face. Oh, we understand it perfectly. We just don't always agree with its conclusions. Anchors secure, Officer Reeves announced, giving a final tug to the complex arrangement of cables now spanning the chasm. Tension distribution optimal, Dr. Blackwood confirmed, studying readings on his device. Should hold approximately 200 kilograms per crossing. I watched in disbelief as Captain Vex attached herself to the makeshift harness they had constructed from parts of their exploration gear. The contraption looked absurdly fragile against the backdrop of the yawning abyss below. This will never work, I muttered, though I continued recording data. If nothing else, future researchers might learn from our spectacular demise. It'll work, Captain Vex said with inexplicable confidence. Reeves, you'll go last with our paralyzed friend. Blackwood, you handle our conscious researcher. I'll go first to secure the far side. Before I could voice any further objections, Captain Vex launched herself across the chasm, using the momentum from her initial jump combined with the tension in the cables to propel herself forward. The acid rain sizzled against her suit as she arched through the air, and for one terrible moment, I was certain the cables would snap. They held, barely. The anchors on our side groaned under the strain, but Captain Vex landed safely on the far edge, immediately securing her position and signaling to us. See? Simple physics, Dr. Blackwood said, adjusting his own harness and then approaching me. Your turn. This is madness, I protested as he attached additional straps around my central mass. The cables are already weakened from acid exposure. The probability of structural failure increases with each crossing. Probably, Dr. Blackwood agreed cheerfully. So we'd better hurry. Before I could formulate another objection, I found myself strapped securely to Dr. Blackwood's chest, my tentacles instinctively wrapping around him in pure terror. On 3, he said. 1, 2. He jumped on 2. The unexpected timing sent us swinging out over the abyss, acid rain pelting us from above, unknown depths yawning below. My scientific mind noted with detached fascination that my chromatophores had gone completely white, a color pattern Floridians displayed only in moments of absolute mortal terror. The crossing took approximately 7.2 seconds. It felt like several lifetimes. When we landed on the far side, Captain Vex helped disentangle my tentacles from Dr. Blackwood, who seemed remarkably unperturbed by having his breathing restricted during a life-threatening maneuver.
Breathing is overrated, he joked when I apologized.
Tried doing field research on Europa. 12 hours in pressurized ice water makes this feel like a vacation. Officer Reeves was already preparing for the final crossing with Zlork. The cables were visibly degrading now, the acid eating through the synthetic fibers strand by strand. Structural integrity at 42%, he reported calmly. Should be sufficient for one final crossing. Should be. I repeated incredulously. Science is all about reasonable risks, Dr. Blackwood said, as if we were discussing an abstract theoretical problem rather than imminent death. Officer Reeves secured Zlork to his back and approached the edge. The cables creaked ominously, sections of the fibers now completely dissolved by the acid. I activated my visual enhancement to calculate the probability of success, and the numbers were grim. Wait, I called out. The structural integrity is insufficient. You need to. But Officer Reeves had already jumped. For one heart-stopping moment, the entire assembly sagged dramatically as additional strands gave way under the combined weight. Time seemed to slow as I watched the cables stretch to their absolute limit. Then, with a final surge of momentum, Officer Reeves cleared the far edge, rolling to distribute the impact and protect his unconscious cargo. The entire cable assembly collapsed into the chasm mere seconds later, dissolving in the acid mists below. "Cutting it a bit close, weren't you?" Captain Vex remarked, helping him untangle from the harness. "Calculated risk," Officer Reeves replied with a shrug. The integrity degradation was within acceptable parameters. I stared at them, these impossible beings who had just defied probability, physics, and common sense to cross an uncrossable chasm using equipment that shouldn't have worked. I struggled to find the words. You knew the cables would fail. Of course, Dr. Blackwood said, already leading us toward the distant outline of Survey Point Echo. Everything fails eventually. The trick is making sure you succeed before that happens. As we made our way to the safety of the backup shelter, acid rain still falling around us, but with the worst of the storm now behind us, I found myself revising my understanding of humanity yet again. It's not just physical durability, I recorded into my scientific log. Humans possess a form of mental resilience that defies rational analysis. When faced with certain failure, they simply reject that certainty. Senior Researcher Quirzap, the Galactic Institute Council has convened for your official report, Admiral Paz-Teal announced, his massive form dominating the central dais of the Grand Amphitheater. We were surprised to receive your transmission requesting this emergency session. I stood before the assembled dignitaries of the Galactic Institute, my chromatophores carefully regulated to display the appropriate patterns of scientific solemnity. Beside me, Zlork fidgeted nervously, still not fully recovered from our ordeal. Esteemed colleagues, I began, my voice amplified throughout the chamber. I come before you today to present findings that will necessitate a complete reclassification of the species known as humans, and indeed, set of our understanding of what constitutes a Deathworld in our galactic categorization system. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Admiral Paz-Teal's eye stalks extended fully, a sign of skepticism. You survived direct contact with humans for nearly 30 hours, he stated. This is unprecedented. Our records suggested such prolonged exposure would be fatal. Not only did we survive, Admiral, I replied, but it was because of the humans that we survived at all. Without them, Zlork and I would have perished within the first hour of the environmental catastrophe. I activated the holographic display, showing recordings of our harrowing journey. The council members' chromatophores flashed patterns of alarm and disbelief as they witnessed the humans battling acid-producing predators, crossing the chasm on deteriorating cables and casually consuming their toxic coffee substances. For generations, we have classified Earth as the most dangerous death world in known space based on its environmental factors: crushing gravity, extreme temperature variations, a toxic oxygen atmosphere, lethal radiation levels, and aggressive indigenous life forms, I continued. But this classification fundamentally misunderstands what makes Earth truly dangerous. I paused for effect, as Captain Vex might have done. Earth is not dangerous because of what it is. Earth is dangerous because of what it produced: humans. These beings didn't merely survive their hostile world, they thrived because of it. The very conditions we consider lethal shaped them into something unprecedented in our galactic understanding. Admiral Paz-Teal's chromatophores displayed patterns of skepticism. You suggest we reclassify based on a single species rather than planetary conditions? I do, I confirmed. Because humans don't simply adapt to their environments, they adapt their environments to themselves. And when that fails, they adapt themselves through technology, cooperation, and an inexplicable psychological trait. They refuse to acknowledge failure as an option. I displayed the final recordings from our journey, showing the moment when Officer Reeves crossed the chasm with Zlork, despite the clearly failing equipment. By any rational calculation, this crossing should have failed. The humans knew this. They calculated the probabilities just as we did. The difference is that they proceeded anyway, operating on the principle that even a minimal chance of success was preferable to guaranteed failure through inaction. The council chamber had fallen completely silent, a rarity for a species as naturally vocal as Floridians. My formal recommendation, I concluded, is that we reclassify Earth not as a death world, but as an adversity crucible, a planetary classification previously considered theoretical. A world so challenging that it produces species with unparalleled adaptability and problem-solving capabilities. As the council digested this information, my communication device chimed. I checked it discreetly, then couldn't suppress a ripple of alarm patterns across my chromatophores. Is something amiss, Researcher Quirzap? Admiral Paz-Teal inquired. I have just received a formal communication from the Human Diplomatic Corps, I said, my voice unsteady. In recognition of our shared experience and the successful completion of first contact protocols, they have extended an invitation for a Floridian delegation to visit Earth itself. Gasps echoed through the chamber. But that's suicide. Zlork blurted out, forgetting proper council protocol. Ah, there's more, I added, reading further with increasing disbelief. They specifically suggest we might enjoy something called tropical beaches and scenic mountain hiking trails as part of what they term a relaxing vacation experience. They describe their world as a paradise. For a moment, complete silence filled the chamber. Then, from somewhere in the back rows, a single Floridian began emitting the rhythmic vibrations of our species' laughter. The sound spread gradually until the entire council was pulsating with it. They consider their death world a vacation destination, Admiral Paz-Teal said when he finally regained his composure. Perhaps this confirms your assessment, Researcher Quirzap. Earth isn't dangerous because of its environment. It's dangerous because it produced a species that looks at acid rain, predators, and crushing gravity and thinks paradise. I adjusted my formal research robes, a new understanding settling over me. With the Council's permission, I would like to accept their invitation, with appropriate safety measures, of course. There is clearly much more to learn about these remarkable beings. Permission granted, Admiral Paz-Teal said, his chromatophores displaying patterns I'd never seen before, something between terror and admiration. But Researcher Quirzap, do be careful with these vacations. I understand they sometimes involve something called swimming. Apparently, humans deliberately immerse themselves in dihydrogen monoxide. For fun. As the council chamber erupted in horrified laughter once more, I found myself wondering what Captain Vex would say about our reaction. I could almost hear her voice. You call this a death world? That's adorable.